Hello again, and welcome to the Group M Services Advantage series. For those that are just joining us, the purpose of this initiative is to shed some light on the topic of identity within addressable media and data-driven marketing. In the previous session, we were joined by Justin Payton from Wunderman Thompson, and we discussed what's happening with identity at a broad level. There were a few takeaways that are worth highlighting from that session. Firstly, although the changes will impact brands, publishers, and agencies in various ways, the changes have been coming for some time and are designed to address the growing needs around data privacy and ethics. Next, there will be fragmentation, and it's likely that we'll never get a single solution that addresses the identity challenges that we'll face with the removal of individual identifiers as they exist currently. And lastly, where there are challenges, there are great opportunities. So whether it be working with partners to share data in a way that respects the needs of consumers or providing consultative services to brands on developing their data strategies. So for this session, we're focusing on the rising importance of first-party data. And on that note, I'd like to introduce our next guest speaker, Chris Jordan, who is the Regional Head of Data, Personalization and Marketing Intelligence at Salesforce, with a background of over 10 years in global agencies and 5 in marketing technology. Jordy, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Excellent. Well, I was just going to say, with a title like yours, I couldn't think of anyone better to discuss this topic. But for those that aren't familiar with you, potentially those outside of Singapore, because this is going to all our APAC teams. Do you want to give us a bit of a background of your experience and I guess what's keeping you busy with clients at Salesforce?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been with Salesforce for coming up to 5 years, incredibly now. Originally in the Sydney office, and then now been based in Singapore for the last 3 years, working across the whole of the region, essentially working with enterprise clients around data strategy, data process, I guess. Not only that, the technology that underpins it, obviously, as the vendor, but more importantly, I guess, working on what's that overview of the user, right? And the customer, and how do we tie that back? Now, prior to that, I actually know this conversation very well because I spent 10 years at BBDO running multiple global accounts out of the Sydney office, the New York office, and the London office. So this world is very common to me, but I think, having come from agency side and come over to the world of Salesforce and the vendor side, there's definitely a opportunity to get closer to understanding what we're doing and how we tie data into that conversation. So yeah, I'm looking forward to getting stuck into it.
Great, fantastic. So I guess let's get into the meaty part, which is first-party data. So the conversation we had previously, we were talking about some of the changes that are coming, in particular around identity, where they came from, so on and so forth. And some of the strategies or focus areas that we spoke about quite often was around first-party data. So I guess my question, or where I want to get your feedback on, is first-party data, and in particular, is it being impacted by these changes? Obviously, a lot of it's focused around third-party cookie and all the deprecation and the support around that. But what's happening with first-party data in this space?
It's a great question. It's one that I get from pretty much every customer on a daily basis that I speak to at the moment. And from our perspective, the short answer is not much, right? Yeah. When it comes to first-party data. Now, obviously, there's a seismic shift happening in the third-party data world, a bit of a shift happening in the second. But the way that we see it and the way that we typically work with customers and think about first-party data, I don't see that much of a change. Now, before I kind of dive in a bit on that, I think it's worth noting that when we say first-party data, there's multiple parts to that. Because I think the other thing is that we use that term very broadly, and there's a lot more to it than just kind of jumping in and saying first-party data. So typically, I would almost see it as 2.5 types of data, right? And the first being first-party unknown data. Right? Now, that's something like a first-party cookie on a brand's website or a publisher's website where that user is engaging, but they're still unknown. But because it's obviously directly on the site and the traffic's directly coming there, that's still first-party data. And I think we too often get confused with talking about third-party cookies and what have you. But actually, there's a whole bunch of rich data that's coming directly from users coming to a page, right? Or an app, right? And so we're still able to collect, store, and understand attributes and behaviors tied to that unknown user at that first party level. Then the other half of it is obviously more where Salesforce is probably more traditionally known as, which is that PII data, or that personal identifiable information, where a customer has either filled out a form or done something that allows us to capture an email address, a name, a phone number, a home address, whatever it may be. And we're obviously collecting and storing that. So when we talk about first party data, I think the first thing to note is that those are the two key buckets. The third or kind of second and a half one that I kind of refer to, which you might have heard in conversation, is obviously zero party data, which is this idea of kind of proactive data that I've given to a brand with things like preferences. Now that for me isn't a separate type of data. It's very much first party data. It's just how we collect it that would define necessarily how we might break that up. So going back to your question, I think if we look at those buckets of data from a first party data perspective and the changes coming, we don't see a massive shift or change in kind of, I guess, at a technical level, anything about what's happening in the first party data world. I guess the only shift that we've seen is that the news about how third-party cookies are being treated and IDFA and all these things, and combine that with things like GDPR and CCPA, etc. I think what we've seen is anything more so an attitudinal shift in consumers, right? In terms of understanding and realizing that their data is being collected in this maybe not so transparent way previously. So if anything, the first-party data from a technical perspective hasn't changed, and we haven't really seen a shift. But what we have seen is this slightly heightened, I guess, concern around first-party data privacy and consent management, which is obviously something that I'm sure we'll cover. But yeah, so overall, not a big shift, not a big change. I think it's kind of keep calm, carry on, and if anything, pivot the strategy to be more around collecting that first-party data.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I think it's a good segue to the next thing which I wanted to touch on was around the strategies around driving that first-party data strategy. Just before I get into that though, it'd be good, and I'm assuming most people in the audience who are watching this would be aware, but it'd be good to reiterate. When you talk about the known and the unknown data and first-party data, is that tied into particular technologies in Salesforce, like CDPs and DMPs, in regard to how that data is kind of collected on your side?
I'm smiling because I put something on LinkedIn about this literally last night, saying, CDP, DMP, WTF. If you have ever asked that question, you're very normal, and I highly recommend you read and this is a shameless plug for a friend's book called Customer Data Platforms that I was literally just finishing, which talks about exactly that, right? Which is what technology is the future. And these guys that actually wrote the book, who is one of the guys, kind of one of the founding members of Crux. So from the DMP days that then obviously moved into be a big part of what Salesforce did when its structure and focus on the ad tech side of things and data management. Now, DMPs in that kind of world of data, I think at the time were pioneering, right? They changed the way that we think about identity and how we collect and store and manage that data. I think we've seen a big shift to this transparency world, because whilst DMPs were fantastic and they collected and stored user level data, it didn't really let you access that user level data. And I think that's the big difference, right? You could create a really rich and specific segment, but you never really got to see who was Chris Jordan, right? There was no PII stored firstly. So whilst we had first party data, it was unknown data, not that known data. And so what we've seen as a result of that is this shift to the CDP world. And that's definitely something that we've focused on. We have released a CDP called Customer 360 Audiences. And for us, it's really around getting to that 360-degree view of the customer. Now, again, that is probably something that you've heard 1,000 times in the last 10 years. But if you look at where the technology has actually been, no one's actually been able to deliver it, right? You've had databases, you've had CRM systems, you've had whatever it may be, but no one's actually got to that kind of golden record where you could actually pull in all the data, see that profile, understand the attributes, behaviors, and intent signals that users given, but then be able to activate the data too. Because I think this is the big thing when you look at that technology. You've got some technologies out there that are very good at collecting and storing it. And then you've got others that are very good at engaging with consumers. There's not many that do both, right? And so this is where our focus has very much been around that. So whilst DMPs still bring huge value and impact, particularly in the media side of things, I think our focus, given that first party and combining the unknown first party and the known first party, is really focused onto two key areas, which I would say would be CDP, which if you look at it, and it gets a bit confusing, but the book talks about a lot about CDMP, right? Where we're able to still activate in those ad tech channels, for example, but you're still collecting and storing the data in that centralized point. And the other one is, which is slightly different, is real-time interaction management. Now, the reason I say that's interesting, and we might come on to this later, is that in order to deliver in real time, you have to have a profile store. And you have to collect and store and know that user and be able to pull data on that user in the moment and then personalize accordingly. So I'd say that those kind of key areas around the CDP itself and that real-time interaction management are kind of where we're seeing customers pivot their strategy to focus on that data collection and storage. And that allows you to get through all the things you need as well, including things like consent, which again is a critical thing.
So that's really good. I got those kind of 3 key takeaways for me from that there. The first one, a new acronym that I'm going to need to remember, so CDMP. The second is, yes, but the holy grail of the single view of a customer and what everyone's really trying to do in that space and how that will be impacted or maybe potentially not impacted in certain scenarios. So there are a couple of big ones for me. And I think now where it will be good to kind of understand a little bit more detail is a little bit around those strategies and how we kind of work on that. And I view this in kind of 2 ways. Those that already have some element of first-party data, right, and they've got a mechanism to collect, they've got a mechanism to do the right segmentation, they have the right governance in place, the right data hygiene. So it'd be good to understand a little bit from your side on what you're seeing with some of your clients, by vertical or whatnot, that maybe have some good practices when it comes to first-party data strategies. Probably just as important is maybe those that do not have that right now, or maybe not being in a position to be able to do that, and what some of the strategies are that they may be looking at, which could be around partnerships. Obviously, for both scenarios, those that do and the do nots, the end goal, and this was the third point that I was going to cover off, is around that connection to activation. So how do we drive that strategy to an activation output? So can you talk through maybe just those 2 a little bit, if that makes sense?
Absolutely. So what I'll do is I'll bucket this as the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? So I would say the first things first on the good. It's few and far between. Now, the reason I say that is that you've got a lot of organizations out there that have got a lot of data, but that data is not structured. It's not in one place. It might be on premise. It might be in the cloud. It might be in systems of record, systems of engagement, and a whole bunch of different places. So I think the first things to note is that when brands in particular come and say, oh, we need a data strategy and we're doing this, that's for me is firstly a huge tick box, right? Because there are not many that have got this in a really good place. And that's being very, very kind of transparent around a lot of strategic customers, and that's all the way from financial services, who are very good at things like transactional data and that sort of things, but they're not very good at tying that to behavioral data or attitudinal data or, those first party unknown impressions, for example. So there's not many that are doing it really well. Now, the ones that are doing it well are setting themselves up from day one with this strategy. And I think before we get to kind of the bad and the ugly, I'd say that the good thing is where people get it right is they don't focus on technology. And I think this is crucial for the way, which is strange for a vendor to be saying, but I think it's critical in that, and this is a huge opportunity for agencies as well. And Justin and I were on a panel just 2 weeks ago talking about this exact same thing, right? Which is that when you look at that data collection policy and process and strategy, it should go in the order of, people, process, tech, right? So you've got to have the right people in place to deliver on the strategy. They need to create that strategy. As they do that, need the right processes to be able to deliver that. And then the final kind of, vehicle almost underpinning it is the technology. And we're the last piece of the puzzle. And I think where people tend to get it wrong is they try and see technology as a silver bullet that's going to solve all of these data silo challenges, these organizational challenges, and this change management problem, right? And so for us, when we look at it, I'd say the first thing to note on that is that not many people are doing it well. The ones that are doing it well are really trying to think about data first, but thinking about data first in the idea of, have we got the right people on board to deliver that structure? If we haven't, who are we engaging? Opportunity massively from my perspective for things like agencies and partners. And then jumping to what's the process and how do we manage that? And again, huge opportunity to drive that, digital transformation and change management. Then finally, how do we have a technology stack that isn't a complete Frankenstack and actually allows us to have this genuine view of the customer that we can start to use? So when I think about who's doing it well, typically, as I say, it's going to be those newer organizations that have got kind of, data collection as pivotal to their brand strategy, right? And it can be a brand strategy. And I think this is the thing, is that I started my career in brand world, not digital world, because it was that long ago. There was no such thing as digital. I just did billboards and TV. It was great fun. Big budgets, great, no measurement. The world has changed a lot since then. Yeah. So I think when you look at that, the companies that are doing this and thinking about their brand as having this value exchange with customers, and that data collection is a two-way street, then they start to do it well. They collect data with consent. They collect clean data. They collect preferences, but they're doing it in a way that's not creepy to start with, but also is very, very transparent. And I think transparency and trust probably the key words, because I feel like we're in a bit of a data crisis around trust. And then I guess to kind of follow up on your question, the other parts, really the ugly for me is using data that hasn't got consent, using data that's dirty, using data that's out of date. Like there's nothing worse. And it's almost worse than no data, right? And what I mean by that is that if you're going to use data to target me or do something that makes me feel uncomfortable, then there's very little chance I'm going to trust the brand moving forward, versus starting from scratch again, even saying, sending an email, if you've got my email address, saying, hey, look, we're cleaning our data. We only want data that you're willing to share with us, but in return, we're going to give you this. Suddenly that's a value exchange that I want, right? And, there are companies that do it brilliantly. Like there's wine deliveries companies that get me every day, right? And they use a really good personalization tactic. And it's like, but I've consented and I've said, this is what I'm interested in. Don't send me the expensive stuff. Send me the stuff that's on sale, and send me these kinds of wines. And as a result, I've got this really good value exchange with them, and I'm a loyal customer. So I'd say that kind of the ugly side for me around the process is very much around using dirty data, buying data from third parties that you don't have that visibility of where it's come from, using it to target people in that creepy way. And then I'd say where to focus, and I guess to the bad, but the bad for me is the opportunity, which is how do I start, right? And so that could be FMCG or non-direct consumer brands, or increasingly a whole bunch of brands that are direct to consumer, but are then selling through a third party, which we see a lot of, right? So, the world of Shopee and Lazada is fantastic because I'm selling, but I'm not always, depending on the agreement, getting that data and really understanding who that customer is, and therefore being able to build that one-to-one relationship and that value exchange. So I think that's the other thing that we're seeing is how do you steer people away? Airlines is a great example of that as well. Or hotels, when we used to be able to travel, that was a big thing because I'd always go through a third party, right? A booking.com, etc. So how do you start to get people to come direct to the site where I can collect it as first party data, even those intent signals? So just which countries was I looking at to go to? What type of flight was I looking for? All these sorts of things. Was I looking for a child ticket and something for my wife, or what was I looking for? Now, if you don't own the properties, it's very hard to do that. So I think that shift of bringing people back in and giving them a value is going to be something that we see as a real focus, and do that. So to sum up, I'd say, look, not many people are doing it well. Those that are, I think, is about having that right people, process, tech in place and starting from scratch with that data value exchange. And I think the hardest thing is, I guess, sunk cost, right? In terms of there's a lot of companies out there that have got different systems doing different things, and it is painful and it does take time. And I think that's the other thing to note is that, turning all of your data to get that 360-degree view of your customer isn't something that happens in a week, right? It's a 6 to 12 to 3-year plan that needs to bring in all those legacy systems and allow you to have access to it so that you can do those two things, as I mentioned, right? Have the insight to understand the user, but then have that layer of engagement to actually push that message out.
There's so much to unpack there. That was, I don't even know where to start, but it's really insightful and really helpful. So I guess the point that you raised about, doing bad rather than not doing it all. I mean, this is what kind of got into the situation that we're in now, right? From a consumer perspective. So I think it's a really, really strong point. The last one you mentioned as well, I think there's some good insights and some strategies there around how you make that connection with consumers direct. And you kind of jumped ahead because one of the questions I was going to ask is, how do some of these people do that when they are, I guess, data poor, for lack of a better choice of words, because they're operating through a retailer or some other intermediary where it's not B2C as such, direct. So that's quite helpful. And I really like the way it's kind of been positioned as the kind of those three pillars around process, people, and tech. the process and people stuff, and you gave a couple of examples around agency opportunities. I'd love to touch on that a bit more, because I think that's what would be most interesting and getting your points of view. I'll leave that to the end, and we'll probably back up on that one. But just to go into the tech side a little bit as well. So we covered a little bit at a top level in terms of what the technologies are, but for a brand, when they're thinking about first-party data and how to leverage that, I mean, what are some of the tech considerations for them? I mean, we're talking about, you know, developing this value exchange. So, you know, I think obviously there'll be things initially like consent management platforms to ensure that they are, you know, they're adhering to what the user wants. Obviously CRMs in terms of managing your records and so on and so forth. Obviously CDPs, I was going to say CDPs, probably less so. And then, yeah, just because you get an understanding of maybe some of the tech considerations, whether that's within a Salesforce stack or just in general, that, you know, these brands would be considering. And then anything in addition to that as well that may sit outside of that. So one that I guess came up in the call that we had with Justin, we started talking about these different solutions, whether they're, you know, the privacy sandbox stuff that is being built by Google, you know, the ID consortiums, and we also spoke a little bit about clean rooms and about sharing data through clean rooms. So probably a bit to unpack there as well from my side. But yeah, what are some of the technology considerations specifically for brands? And then after we touch on tech, we can probably summarize a little bit on the people and process for an agency.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, Eric, to your point, I think the hard thing is tech changes all the time, right? So whilst the first party data and third party data world is changing all the time, so is technology. And, you know, hot things that are on the top of the hype curve at one point, everyone gets very excited about, very quickly slide down to be the kind of, you know, trough of disillusionment, right? Where someone goes, oh, I thought I was going to have the perfect customer record without having to do any implementation. And I was going to get 40 data silos across my entire business tied into one. The reality is that's never going to be the case, right? Now, we can only build technology to a certain point. We are doing that. And we're kind of, our real focus around that customer 360 audiences, our CDP piece is really tied to that. And I think there's a couple of things that if you look at that, one of the most critical is really the data model, right? So the actual mapping of data itself, because what's traditionally been the hard thing around this side of things is, as marketers, let's take a step back. I think as marketers, we've always been in the brand world or the performance world, and we've been driving that awareness, and we've been very top of funnel. I think what we've seen is that CMOs and, you know, CDOs and even, you know, the new chief growth officers or chief customer officers, right, are starting to own the customer experience end to end. So whilst marketing used to just be one end, it didn't really play down the other side. What we're seeing is that marketing is now becoming more and more responsible for that end-to-end customer experience. Because of that, the way that we think about data and the way that we think about tying all these data systems together has changed. So a CDP, whilst it's designed for marketers, because the idea is that marketers own that customer relationship, it's not heavy tech designed by, you know, to be used by coders, right? Or kind of data scientists or analysts. It is very much there designed by business users and marketers, which obviously have to upskill in some level. But for example, we've built our CDP on the cloud information model, where we've worked with multiple global partners in the data to have a same data structure. So we're super kind of aligned globally on that ability to map that data. So I'd say the first things first is that whilst the technology has changed a lot, I think it's changed in line with the role of the marketer. And I think that's really important, because suddenly marketing is going to have to own cross-sell, upsell, you know, service engagement. You know, am I marketing to somebody when they're annoyed with me, right? There's no way that we should be doing that. But if I don't tie those data sources together, I'm never going to be able to do that. So I think that's kind of the first thing around the kind of technology, is that it needs to be user-friendly. I would say the kind of 3 buckets that we would really focus on would be the ability for it to be used by the business user without a heavy dev setup. You don't have to run SQL to be able to, you know, actually create a segment or understand a user, right? I could log in. I can't code, right? I could jump in and have a look and actually understand what's going on, use that data, create some segments, do some analytics and understand it. And the other thing which I'd say is that we kind of think of too often we separate those two worlds of the system of insight and the system of engagement. And if the two aren't talking to each other and aren't working closely together, then you're never going to get that end-to-end customer experience using all that data and all that insight, but also then engaging them, because good data is irrelevant if you can't use it, right? And we speak to a lot of customers that have got unbelievable data warehouses and, you know, data lakes they've set up, and they're brilliant. and the data in there is super rich, and they've got propensity scoring and data science models, and we're like, this is great. And we're like, so what's the results like when you target that segment with that? And it's like,
use cases aren't quite there. Yeah.
Oh, we haven't done that yet. It's like, what's the point of having that data? So for us, I think the way that we think about technology playing that role is combining those two things. So when we think about our CDP, it's really about combining that system of insight along with that system of engagement into one place, so that you can then understand and go, wow, this is interesting insight, but I need to activate it. Yep. And the other thing that we probably haven't touched on anywhere near enough, which underpins the tech piece, but is very closely tied to data, is the buzzword of AI, which again, needs to be designed in a way that is user-friendly. So we've got things that are very simple, right? That will seem simple, but are very clear. So propensity of which channel you're going to open a message from, right? So am I more likely to engage on email, SMS, Facebook, for example? So we can automate that process using our AI capabilities of Einstein to say, well, this person's way more likely to engage on this channel and at this time. So we can do send time optimization. So these little simple use cases that we forget about from an AI perspective don't work if you don't have that centralized view of the data and that unified customer profile that you need to have access to.
100%. So centralized view, and I think as we all probably said before in the past, it's a bit of a case of garbage in and garbage out as well, right? So ensuring what's coming in is handled in an effective way. I think some other really good points you raised too is, around the end user of these platforms, and also, from my opinion, I think getting that balance right, between making sure it can be in the hands of the right people, but also too, there's enough transparency so it's not a complete black box, right? So you understand enough, and obviously validate the performance of this when it comes to paid media, through another source. But that's really helpful from a tech perspective.
That's a really good point. Really good point you made there, which I think is the other thing that we probably haven't seen enough of is things like sales and service being tied to paid activity. So whilst it might be good, they might have done a good job previously on owned, so sending an email to someone or not sending an email to someone. What we've done, there's been a disconnect, and this is something that we spend a lot of time doing, and I think is important for the outcome, is that paid media is part of that. So for example, if I'm an existing customer and I've got an open service complaint, I should be being suppressed from all paid activity, right? Like, not only am I going to be enraged by being targeted at that point, I'm more likely to jump on a social channel and have a moan about it because you just prompted me in a bad experience, right? And so if service, for example, and a service ticket and complaint isn't tied to what's happening with paid, then again, you're going to have that, I guess, personalization paradox gap whereby you've got a user that's kind of saying, why the hell don't you know me? I thought we had a value exchange and you've just broken it. So I think that's the other critical thing of tying paid activity into the owned activity.
Definitely. I couldn't agree more. And I think on that note, it's a good segue to probably the last thing that we want to discuss in a bit more detail. And then again, going back to your analogy around people, process, and tech. So from the people side, the role of the agency. So I guess what we're looking at is, what is the role of the agency to support brands when it comes to first-party data strategy? And from your point of view, are there opportunities you feel from a technical support perspective? Is it more upper funnel strategic stuff? And kind of break this down in, I guess, maybe kind of 3 sub-questions. So, what is the role of the agency in this work stream? What are the skill sets you feel need to exist in the agency, or what are the kind of teams that would be getting involved with these conversations? And I guess last as well, what would an agency need from the brand, or what should they be asking the brand to kind of help them, in terms of driving success when it comes to first-party data strategies?
So great questions. And I think if you start with the role of the agency, I think for me, and this is what Justin and I talked a lot about, right, is that it can be very open depending on the customer. Fundamentally though, I think if you're a good agency partner, the opportunity to be driving that C-suite level conversation around data strategy is crucial. Now, some brands might already have an idea and be doing it. Others might be very slow and behind the curve, but there might be some that they're not quite there, right? And I think there's an opportunity for agencies to be the drivers behind the thinking of the data strategy, right? Now, we do a lot of this sort of stuff. We talk to, CMOs, CIOs, CEOs, et cetera, about data strategy and what have you. But the reality is that we're doing a lot of the tech on the ground work. And there isn't that many people probably at that C-suite level having the conversation. So the first role I'd say is driving that change management, digital transformation from the top down, given the sort of deep-rooted relationships that agencies have with their customers and their brands. The second I would say is really a big one for me, which is that whilst lots of brands want to do this, I think what you'll find is that they see this as going, well, I need an extra 10 headcount to do this. And I don't have 10 headcount. So I'm going to have to outsource that opportunity, right? So where do I start? Not only on the strategy, but also, you know, going through the actual technical kind of understanding and architecture and design of how this could work. So I think what we tend to see quite a lot is that customers want this, but they're too focused on keeping on the lights. And as a result, this is where
they're running of the operations.
And so I think there's a huge opportunity for agencies to kind of jump in there and kind of be that handhold, guide them on the strategy at the top level, and then help with the implementation, right? And start to drive that value by delivering on that data strategy. And the other thing I would say, which we don't see enough of, I think it's talked about quite a lot, but it's not often done, is test and learn. And I think it doesn't have to be a top-down, all-in digital kind of transformation project of we're moving to a customer data platform and we're going to upheaval everything we've already done and all of our legacy systems. It could just be, you know, we're going to start by tying service data with paid activity. One use case, and we'll see what the ROI and the value it can be. And that's something that I think the agency can really drive by helping to kind of steer that use case driven approach. But also, I think Justin and I refer to this a lot. You guys have such a deep relationship with your customers. You know their pain points. I think where we go wrong on projects where we're trying to do things like data strategy and what have you, is not tying it back to a critical pain point, and therefore not getting the ROI and then getting that wow moment from the customer. Because I think whilst a lot of the stuff can happen behind the scenes and you can see efficiencies and things like that, all too often, you know, CEOs go, yeah, whatever, but it hasn't affected my bottom line. Whereas if you've got a challenge that you know in a customer and you can use that as the pivot point or the kind of, I guess, the catalyst of that change, then you can go in there and say, this is an opportunity. And then they say, we don't have anybody to do it. You hold your hands up and say, well, we've got a team ready, right? We've got a combination of strategists, architects, tech people, you know, developers. We've got everything. We're ready to go. And here's how we think we should approach the strategy. And then when you get to this point, we think you should, you know, look at vendors. And here's the couple of vendors that we know based off our analysis can deliver on that. Now it's time to make a decision based off X, Y, Z. And that's typically how I see a massive opportunity for agencies to go in and steer and drive that conversation a bit more, versus where I think we go wrong, which is where, you know, we might go in and have a conversation without the agency. And it's kind of like, well, hang on, why are we not doing this as a three-way at the table, right? Should be a three-way conversation versus being brought in too late when the digital strategy has been created by a vendor, for example, and you guys have not been involved.
Yeah, definitely something I think we can talk a lot further about. But I completely agree. I think in particular, when you're talking about test and learns, like it really demonstrates, you know, a proactive approach about trying to identify those opportunities. And as you said, you know, being able to deliver it as well. So look, on that note, I've taken up more time than I've asked you to commit to. So Geordie, I do appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us today. I certainly got a lot from this session, and I'm sure our viewers would also. So really, really do appreciate it, and for sharing your points of view. So thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining as well. That's it from me for the series, but we will continue. And Chris Packman, the Senior Director of Client Development for Group M Services, will be leading discussions with a fantastic lineup on the topic of partnership. So until then, take care, and I hope you enjoyed the session. Thank you, everybody.